Let's talk about confidence intervals. Before we start confidence intervals, there's some skills you're going to need. You should be comfortable with probability, the z-table, and maybe most important of all, sampling distributions. Let's talk about confidence intervals for population proportion. That's what we're going to do in this video. By the way, like I said in the introduction, you really need to be pretty good with a normal distribution table and concepts of sampling distributions and so on. So if you need to, go back and take a look at those videos to familiarize yourself with them. I'm going to be referring to some of those ideas and assuming some familiarity with some of those ideas as I talk about confidence intervals for population proportion. Here's a little background. Let's imagine that you're some sort of researcher. You're a demographer or you're a pollster, whatever. And you go out and you talk to the public and you get a p-hat from your sample, say a sample of 100, doesn't really matter. Your sample of 100 people that you talk to, you get a p-hat of 0.6. Now, what is a p-hat? A p-hat is the sample proportion. So, for example, if we're analyzing support for candidate A, whoever that is, you find out that from your sample of 100, 60 out of the 100 supported candidate A. Here's the problem. You don't really know how representative of the entire voting population, maybe it's New York, maybe it's Chicago, maybe it's some other place, California, I don't know. You don't know how representative of the population your sample is. And without getting too much into the weeds right now, the legalisms, because it's not really the point of this video so much, depending on the circumstances, for example, whether or not you're trying to get a proportion for continuous data or discrete data like candidate support would be, or various other details, the probability that you're exactly correct is either going to be near zero or a zero. We'd have to talk about calculus to prove exactly why that's the case, but it is. You're probably not going to be correct. Now, most people, and they'd be right in saying this, most people by common sense would say, well, I don't really care. If it's close, that's close enough. For example, in politics, you're really wondering whether or not that's above or below 50%. That's really what's important, or what's most important anyway, right? So close is good enough in a lot of cases. But we need to be able to talk kind of specifically about this in statistics. What constitutes close? And what's the likelihood that we are close? We're going to talk about that, and we're going to try to quantify that. Let's talk about first what a confidence interval looks like, so you know what we're working towards, okay? We're going to come around to this again, and throughout this video, I'm going to show you the idea behind confidence intervals so you can conceptualize it, and then also a formula just so you can calculate it. This is what we're going after and what we're shooting for, the first of two forms that I'm going to show you. Let's put it this way at first. I'm going to write this. What does that say? That's a confidence interval. I'm writing the probability that the true population proportion is between 0.55 and 0.65 is 95%. I wrote 0.95, but we can think of that as 95%. Now think about what I'm saying. We just got a p-hat, support for candidate A, and our p-hat was 0.6. And with the right mathematics, we would turn around and be able to say, well, the probability that the real population proportion is between these two numbers is 95%. So now what we've said is we are not totally exactly sure how accurate this is. But we can give a span of numbers, an interval across which we're working, and also assign that a probability of being correct. We call it a confidence level, but certainly for now anyway, you can think of it as a probability expression. So this, by the way, is what allows us to have confidence above zero. If you'll remember, just now, a second ago, I said the probability of us being exactly right is either near zero or a flat true zero, depending on the nature of the data that we're looking at and so on. So we can't say, well, public support for candidate A is 0.6 without deep down being aware that we're not going to be exactly right. This is a much more supportable statement by making, rather than a single, it's called a point estimate. Rather than having a single point estimate where the usefulness is kind of doubtful, I can give a span, I can give an interval, it's a confidence interval, and say, look, it's going to be between these two numbers based on our research. It's going to be between these two numbers, and this is how confident I am that that's going to be the case. So that's useful. Now I can turn around and talk to my party donors or anybody else in politics and say, well, okay, the point estimate gives us not much confidence because maybe it's 0.6, maybe it's 0.5, maybe it's 0.4. We really don't know what the chances are that it would reach that low or reach higher than that. But look, now you can donate money, Mr. Party Donor, because I'm actually able to tell you that it's 95% probable. There's a probability of 0.95 that it's actually between these two numbers, and gee, the lower number is well above 0.5 anyway. So our candidate A is looking pretty good for the election. Much more useful. It has an interval and it has a probability of being right. We think of it as a confidence interval. The reasoning for that comes later. I'll show you a different way to express the same thing. I've written something here, and I put it in quotes because this is kind of a standard formulation for the verbal version of a confidence interval, right? In a lot of stat textbooks or stat works in general, research, they're going to use either this formulation or something that's really close to it. So this is a standardized formulation. I also converted our figures to percentages, but I don't think that's going to confuse anybody. Here's a standard formulation. We are 95% confident that the true population proportion, P, is between 55% and 65%. That's really saying the same thing as the mathematical form probability statement that I wrote in the immediately previous segment. Up next, part 2.